Yeah, if we're talking about probate and what the process looks like, it really starts with opening an estate with the state of North Carolina and inventorying all of your probate assets for public record. Essentially, we have to keep track of all of the assets coming into an estate, how those assets are being handled while they're in the estate, and then eventually what happens to them when the estate's distributed. While all that's going on, things like final taxes, final expenses, all of those types of things are being tracked, and all of those transactions have to be kept track of for the clerk of court. And it probably goes without saying that that's really, really time consuming and can get really, really expensive depending on the amount of assets that are going through that process. And so fortunately, a well-crafted estate plan can completely avoid probate, or at least get us most of the way there, depending on the different assets you have. So if you're interested in figuring out how to avoid probate, give us a call. We're happy to help. A revocable trust is one of the best tools that we can use for probate avoidance. It really functions by essentially taking everything that would ordinarily go through a probate process and moving it into this private trust bucket that you're creating. Essentially, that trust bucket gets administered the same way that a probate estate would, but it's happening faster. It's a little bit more efficient. We're not having to go back and forth with the clerk of court. And so by creating that trust estate, that trust bucket, we're able to move assets through an estate much quicker. When we're talking about an estate, there's a couple different roles that you have to know about. One is the role of an executor or even a trustee if we're talking about a revocable trust, and that's really who administers the estate and ultimately makes sure that your wishes are carried out. We also have something called a beneficiary, and that's who ultimately receives the assets of your estate. And it's the job of that executor or a trustee, depending on the estate plan structure, to make sure that the beneficiary receives the assets on the terms that you've provided. If you die without any sort of an estate plan, some of your assets may be subject to something called intestacy. Intestacy is basically a statutory scheme that tells us who the beneficiaries of your estate are. In that case, we call beneficiaries heirs. They're the heirs of your estate. And North Carolina state law might give us different heirs than who you really want to be the ultimate beneficiary of your estate. For example, most people assume that if they're married, that their entire estate will just be distributed to their surviving spouse. But if assets are going through a probate proceeding and they're married with children, then there's actually some sort of a split depending on the number of children you have, where your spouse will receive a certain amount of assets and your children will receive the remaining balance. Ultimately, a well-crafted estate plan will help you avoid exposure to the probate process. That may be leveraging things like beneficiary designations and keeping things simple, or maybe we decide it makes more sense to use a revocable trust for more complete probate avoidance. Regardless of what you ultimately decide, we want to make sure that it works for you. And if you want to talk about it, just give us a call. We're happy to help.